Yeah, so tell me about your email you sent to me.
Yeah,
okay. Out of the blue.
So I was on a flight from Beijing to San Francisco, and I didn't have any Wi-Fi because I had no network. And I was looking on my iPad for things to do, and I found your book on it because I had downloaded it back when I found your website.
When was that?
2 years ago.
But was that after Rochester or before? I don't remember.
I don't remember when I actually downloaded the book, but I remember thinking, oh wow, this is like an immigrant story of a childhood. I've been meaning to do something like that for myself. But then since there was already one existing, I had downloaded it and said, okay, at some point I'd like to read this. And that point happened to be when I had my airplane delay. Mm-hmm. And so I had maybe 2 or 3 hours, and I was stuck on an airplane, literally, because they didn't let us leave. Or
so you're on the plane.
We were on the plane,
that's terrible.
and it wasn't even like they didn't let us watch TV. It was just a bad situation. So I started reading the book, and then as I was reading it, I started having a lot of memories of the same type of situations that I had been in. Mm-hmm. And then I pulled out my phone and started just jotting down the things that I connected with, and then afterwards I sent the email.
Cool. Yeah, that was really cool to get that out of so just for reference, this is the On-the-Move book. This is not the thing I wrote about my PhD. This is the thing I wrote this, there's about 200 pages. It's all online on my webpage. I'll put a link up to it. I wrote that for reals, during my junior year of college. And then, so my mother's a sociology professor, so she's always been interested in this stuff. So she's always been interested in having me write about my weird childhood and stuff. And so during my childhood, I wrote a lot of this manuscript just in rough form, just as diaries or notes, because we moved around so much. And then that summer, I think, this was 2004, that was a long time ago. This is my junior year of college, between junior and senior year. I decided to put it all together, and my mother knew some people at academic publishers, because they kind of would publish these sorts of case studies or memoirs or these things. These would not be a popular press, right? So these are academic publishers. So we gave it to some people that she knew, and they kind of took a look, gave us some good feedback, but it wasn't really the right thing to publish for them because they were interested more in scholarly works. But still, it was a first exposure. And then 3 years later, this is 2007, one of these small publishers was interested in publishing it, and they did several print runs and stuff. And really, the people who bought these were mostly university people from universities, people my mother knew from her line of work, who kind of assigned it as kind of supplementary reading, or they would assign chapters out of it for classes. So this was actually used in these social science or Asian American studies classes. And that's why I think one of the PDFs, I don't think the version you had it, but it has these silly study questions in the back. I don't know if you remember, so they're really silly because they wanted me to put in these questions about every chapter, what you read in high school, right? What did you think about this thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because it was supposed to be
to prompt critical thinking.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a not textbook, but one of these readers you use for class. But then, not many people got the book because it wasn't a popular press Random House or anything. And, I was busy with grad school and doing my thing. And, later on I decided just to put it up on my website. So I just put up as HTML on my website. I made it into an ebook format. What did you download it as?
Ebook.
So
it was in my iBooks.
Yeah, I put it into several ebook formats, which was great because people prompted me to do that. So I converted the PDF into ebook or whatever. And
that made it a lot easier because I made the decision to have it to own the content, but then I didn't actually read it until later. But if it hadn't been in that format, it wouldn't have been as easy. Yeah,
so that was a good call. Yeah, someone encouraged me to not just in PDF but in ebook, because PDF I guess you download it unless you have Dropbox or something. It's
exactly
lost. Yeah, so the format does really matter a lot. So yeah, but it was great getting your email because I had not thought about that topic for literally a decade, right? Because the last decade has been about research and being a PhD and being a professor and all the very researchy things, and all the childhood stuff has not come up ever. So I'm glad you brought it up again.
Yeah, for me it was really serendipitous because this was at the end of a trip back to Mongolia, which I hadn't been back to Mongolia in about 8 years.
Wow.
And my family was reuniting for the first time in a long time. And we also just had a new birth in the family, so it felt very this accumulation of family and childhood memories all in one place.
Wow.
And I had always thought that I was really unique.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most people like to think that they're very special, but I thought that my experience of being an immigrant was so different than all these other people who were immigrants.
And were all these other people you grew up
People
knowing?
I knew, people I met.
So what do you think was the typical path? I want to move the camera back a little. What do you think was the typical path for being an immigrant or an Asian American immigrant?
I think the typical path was actually I don't know if I thought about that.
Like if you had to just sum like why you were different, right? If you had to just sum it up, like what would not being different mean?
I think I imagine families moving together.
Okay, so the family together, and what would the parents be moving for? I guess?
Work.
Okay, for work, right? Or graduate school.
Yeah.
So
and
work
so you
school.
come with your family,
Right.
and then usually I imagine immigrants as people who were educated, because that's the route out from a lot of these countries is someone who has the money, the status, but sometimes, and the potential to then be able to leave their country. And
Right.
so I saw most immigrants as being financially well off or even like well educated. Whereas my family, while it was education that brought them, it was more like a financial struggle. Specifically Asians, I saw East Coast Asians as educated, like people who came for school, and then West Coast Asians as like second or third generation immigrants of family members who came here for the gold rush or like for financial.
Like in San Francisco and Seattle. Yeah.
Because once I came to San Francisco, a lot of the immigrants I met, actually, I didn't meet a lot of immigrants here. I met more second generation immigrants.
The children of immigrants.
And then their parents were more like, oh, they came here looking for work, and then they worked, as laborers, not necessarily doing education. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was these two paths, right, that, like you mentioned, there's the highly educated path. So my parents came here, my mother came here for graduate school, and then our whole family was able to immigrate because she got a job as a professor here, and that's what sponsored her whole immigration. But they're also, we have extended, and like I talked about in the book, like at the end in New York City, we had extended family who came here. Like, I don't even know how we came here, right? Like, but they were not educated, right? They
the
were
one you stayed with.
Yeah, the one we stayed with. So they were like,
seamstress.
yeah, they're seamstress, they're garment workers, and like the men worked in like construction, not really construction, but like various labor, like painting, construction, and they lived in Queens and Brooklyn, and in not super safe neighborhoods. Whereas we came, we didn't have much money when we came, but we had higher education and kind of an upward kind of social mobility, whereas they didn't.
Yeah,
so.
And that's one thing I think I never thought about also is parents who had to leave their children to find a better future for the long run. But like in that moment when you are making the decision to separate your family, it's hard because you don't know what the repercussions will be on your child. But for me, I had a lot of abandonment issues I dealt with my mother and father for leaving me, right, while they went to America. And me not having an understanding.
And did you remember? I mean, so what was the
that.
timeline? How old were you when you had to stay? And, general.
One of my earliest memories is me sitting in front of a TV watching a commercial of a mom, dad, and child going to get ice cream, and I was crying.
This is in Mongolia.
In Mongolia. And I was crying because I didn't have parents that I could do that with. And my grandparents, I remember coming into the room and being like, it's okay, they're in America. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean?
And how old were you?
I must have been like 4.
Okay, yeah.
And again, my condition is my mom was, in high school when she had me. And it was also during political turmoil in Mongolia. And even though they were still in America, I was then taken by my grandparents because they were just too young to take care of a child. She was
so how did
school.
your parents immigrate to America?
My mom's like an audacious, independent thinker that randomly had the idea one day and decided to go apply for a visa. And then my dad ended up flipping a bunch of cars because he was a mechanic to make the money to come to America. And then they came here with like $300.
So they just came because they wanted to come and they just wanted to,
see what was up.
It was like a gold rush thing of, this is
something
there. And where did they land?
They landed here in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
They actually lived in Oakland on San Pablo for a while. Again, not in a very like great neighborhood because they only had like $300 cash.
And they didn't know anyone in San Francisco? Wow.
No, it's a crazy story. They came to San Francisco, took a BART here, and they were like walking around, and they saw a man that might look Mongolian, and my dad said, I think we should go talk to him, I think he's Mongolian, and they did, and he was, and he said, who are you guys? And they're like, we just landed, and we don't know anyone here.
From boat or from plane?
From a plane.
Wow.
They flew from Beijing, and then the guy took them into his home, and it was actually a 1-studio apartment that like 8 other Mongolians were living in together.
So they didn't have a plan of where to stay when they first came. They're just like, we're just going to go for it.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. But also, she was like 24? No, 24? So they were just kids, right? It wasn't like anyone told them what was happening here. Yeah. It was also, again, the conditions of like the fall of communism in Mongolia wasn't very ideal. And my mother was educated in computer science, so she also had quite a lot of, intelligence in terms of like deducing where there would be the highest likelihood of success for her. But then the guy enrolled her in school, and she ended up going to Laney College in Oakland. And then my dad would just sit around. You know where those like gas stations where they're laborers? Mm-hmm. Yeah, my dad just would sit there and wait for work, and then he ended up working in construction. And my mother ended up in Albany, New York, which was how I came to America, because she put her resume onto monsters.com, which was one of the first resumes to be admitted. This was like 1997.
Wow, that's super old. Yeah, monsters.com is super old.
And she got a job offer from Albany, New York, because she knew this programming language called Silverstream, or this tool. It was on her resume, and they saw it.
So specific.
They sent her a check for relocation, and my mom was like, wow, we can go there, we have money, and now I have a job. So they packed up their car and drove
how long was she in San Francisco before this New York job came?
3 years, probably.
3 years. So was she working? Oh, she was going to school.
She was going to school, yeah. Wow. And she was working as a hospice worker, so she's always taking care of, like as a nurse, like a night nurse, things like that.
Wow, it is a really small world, because I don't think I mentioned in my book, but like, so my mother came to SUNY Albany for graduate school. For
no
PhD.
way!
Yeah. I probably told you this sometime, but it all the lines crossed. Yeah, so my mom came in 1984, because we're like 10 years older or so. Yeah, and she came basically because she was in college in China, and these 2 professors from SUNY Albany just came to visit China because they just, for outreach and for just, travel and stuff. And they gave a talk at her university in Guangzhou, which is in the southern part of China. And then she was, she's also obviously very adventurous and very, very, very assertive as well. So she talked to them, and they were like, yeah, maybe we could sponsor you to have a scholarship or something to just do a master's, right? They were just like, let's just do 2 years, just do something in the U.S. We can give you a scholarship for 2 years. And then she just packed her bags and went, and she flew from Hong Kong or wherever to JFK, to New York City, and took the bus up to Albany. And so she was in Albany. She was originally, that was right after I was born. So I was raised by my grandparents like yourself, and my dad was working and traveling around in Europe and other countries around that time. So he was around, but not as much, right? So basically I was raised by my grandparents. So my mom so she did her PhD for 5 years. So she didn't intend to stay for all those years, but the conditions were reasonably good, but she obviously missed home and everything, but she was already there. Yeah, so she spent 5 years in Albany, New York, 5 winters in Albany, New York. Yep, Albany, New York is 5 years. Yeah.
So since then, my parents are very giving people because of the fact that their story is like a lot of people giving them things when really they don't need to. So a lot of the Fulbright scholars or master's students or PhD students from Mongolia that come through SUNY Albany has come from my house.
Oh wow,
they'll
that's
live.
Great.
Some of them have lived with us because my parents are like, we want to pass on that, the gratitude from people who have helped us as well.
That's wild. Yeah, because when my mom went to SUNY, they didn't know anyone, right? And there were some foreign graduate students back then, but nobody knew anything back then, right? That was before people had the web or could look anything up. Yeah, that was so wild. And then she lived with several roommates in an apartment. They were all American, right? So that was how she started assimilating, getting used to American stuff. And her English was actually pretty good, because they studied English in China, the more well-educated students did, and then she learned really fast. So, I think having good, both my parents, I think their English is pretty good. So having better English abilities just helps them, just in society and stuff here. But yeah, that is wild. Yeah, that's the Albany connection.
So one other thing that I thought was pretty wild was your desire to reject your immigrant story. Because that's something that I feel guilty about. Because I remember when I started making friends in elementary school.
This is in Albany.
This is in Albany, exactly.
Very white area.
So again, I was able to come to America because my mom finally had a visa in which she could bring me over.
So she was working in Albany, like she had a full-time job.
She worked for the state, so and it was she still does. It was like the greatest. She still does actually. She has a great pension. Like everything's great. It's not high pressure, high risk. Like
well, that's really
very
good.
low key work, and she loves it. So at first I was in this like really terrible school, which like I was in the same situation as you, where I was the only Asian person in this like mainly African American community where there was a lot of crime. My mom visited the school and it was like, wait, this can't be the only school around here, and then we had switched. But then when we switched, she obviously made a decision to put me in a very like. It was a great neighborhood that we moved to, which was Guilderland. I don't know if you know, but Guilderland has very good ratings for the public school system.
So it was a much nicer neighborhood.
Yeah, and so then the kids that I started hanging out with were very privileged. Like I'd go to their house and they had a nanny, right? And I was like, "Who is this woman that lives with you?" And they're like, "Oh, she's like my babysitter, and she's been around before I was born." And they have like 6 kids. And
so did you live in the nice area, or were you able to like?
We lived in an apartment.
Right. So you live in an apartment in a nice area, so you could afford it. Yeah,
exactly.
That makes sense.
And the apartment complex was great. I was mostly friends with other immigrant children. The other thing was I was never friends with like Chinese, Korean, or Japanese kids because they all clicked together. So I had a band of girls and we were Filipino. One of us was Vietnamese, and then we were all like from different countries that weren't.
Yeah. Now, did you look clearly different than Chinese and Japanese? Were you darker skinned? So
I was very darker skinned.
You don't look super different than Chinese, right? Because if you're Vietnamese or Filipino, you look darker. You have different features. So how come
Well, so you said you went to Chinese school on Sundays, so like those kids would then be friends in school, and then I wouldn't be able to like be friends with them because when I sat down at a table with them, they'd be talking about things that I wasn't part of.
But they still spoke in English, I
yes,
assume, right?
Yes,
But it's just that they knew each other through that. Yeah.
And like hanging out after school, all the Chinese kids hung out together. Like it would always be, Zizi and, so I don't remember Zizi's friends, but I remember Zizi. She actually lives here now. It's funny.
Small world.
But it made me. So then there was a couple of those girls that I was friends with, but I actually felt like I wanted to be part of like the popular girl crew, and they were all the white girls, and they were all like blonde. And
this is the time the Mean Girls movie came out.
Yeah,
it was like 2004 or whatever.
And so I became friends with one girl who invited me to her house, and I was just like floored. Because I'd been to my friend Raynolyn, and she was Vietnamese. No, Raynolyn Conchella. What kind of name is that?
Filipino.
Yeah, she's Filipino. So her home was the same as mine. It was an apartment. It was a group of immigrants. We didn't have a lot of like fancy furniture, like anything. And then I went to this other girl's house who was American, and it was a mansion with tennis courts. And I was like, who is this woman and this family? And over time, I just became so obsessed with wanting that life because it seemed so perfect from my perspective. And I was like, this is America, and I want to be like them. Why did I have to be the immigrant who doesn't have a lot of friends and whose parents are kind of strict and cheap and doesn't buy anything nice for the house? And I felt so guilty feeling that way, like as an adult, where I'm like, I can't believe I felt that way. And it took me a long time to finally be okay and like be proud that I'm immigrant. And
when did that turn? How do you feel now about that? And when did you change?
I don't know when I changed. I don't know.
Like, was it a sudden thing? Like, you just felt like an adult? You're like, okay, like that was my childhood, or was it just gradually?
I think it was gradual, especially like So what ended up happening that was a little different for me was I got placed into an international boarding school when I was in high school. I'm a Willard, and that also just like exposed me to a lot of international students.
So that was an international, but it was in the U.S.
Yeah, it was in Troy, New York. It was
okay.
in Albany, yeah. But that gave me like I had friends from Ethiopia and like Botswana and Korea and Japan, but they were from there. Like on Christmas breaks, they would go back to their country and come back. And then that, I think, made me feel proud to be Mongolian, where I got to contribute to the diversity of the school. And like, I remember very clearly that I had my flag, and every time I would attend a new school, they'd have to buy a flag because I was the first Mongolian person to attend that school. And so then that became very proud, like it built that pride in me where I'm like, wow, wherever I go, I like carry my flag with me. And then there'd be a flag of like 20 countries, and then there would be a ceremony where they're like, I'm going to put this flag up. This is the international
school or even the local?
At the international school, and then at college too. There wasn't a Mongolian flag before I went to U of R, and then they got one. But, and I remember the first time I saw it, I'm like, oh, they got one. And then afterwards, a lot of other Mongolian students were enrolled in the school too, but I'm like, I was the first one.
And did you think that those other, I mean, did they know you at all, like the other Mongolian students, or it's just happenstance?
So the only other 2 Mongolian students that came after me to U of R, I met like that year that I was back in school, and I actually met them because I was at Chi-Fi and I saw a Mongolian flag, and I'm like, what is this doing here? And they said there's a Mongolian kid. I actually had dinner with him in Mongolia because he lives there now after he graduated.
Yeah. Wow, that is wild. Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. It's yeah. So I mean, when you were going back to the Mean Girls era, of, yeah, I mean, I just could imagine like that for girls. It could be so, the effects are exacerbated so much, right? Because of the the popularity thing and appearances and everything. That just must be wild.
Yeah. And again, what I liked about what you said was I felt like I wasn't Chinese, but I felt like I wasn't American. And there was this like medium location where you didn't really have an identity, and each identity that you thought you wanted felt like you weren't enough, right? And I wonder again, like how many other people feel like this, and the fact that most of media representation of identity is very polarized. It's either you're this or you're that. And like, in my situation, I mean, I was Mongolian American and you were Chinese American, but those stories don't get talked about as much. It's
well, especially for for Asian cultures that are not as well represented, right? If you're the only Mongolian American in the school, right? Whereas there's a lot of Chinese, right? I mean, relatively there's a lot. And then if you think about zooming out about media, right? Like it's already hard enough to get someone who is of Asian descent on in the mainstream media in the U.S. So then thinking about if someone who is Mongolian is even more of a minority because they're just fewer. And like and like we talk about this thing where people describe Asian Americans as this pan-Asian thing, but it's a giant continent, right? There's all these different. I mean, the different countries and even areas within countries are so different from each other. But zooming out, it's like maybe progress is made one step at a time, and we want some representation at first, and then we can zoom in and such. But it's pretty wild that way.
Another thing, so I went to Sundance this year, and we actually attended this Pan-Asian panel about Asian representation in film.
Oh, wow.
And I also watched.
And did you go as an attendee, or did you have a project?
Just an attendee, yeah. It was just for fun, but I ended up like turning it into like research in my mind, obviously.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting because the panelists were all different Asians. It wasn't like one type of Asian, and they were all doing very different things. They weren't actually telling stories about being Asian. They were like, some of them were telling stories of being an artist or being a cook or whatever was of interest to them, and it was very enlightening to see that we were banding together to represent Asia as like a continent, as like a group of people. But then, like you said, still within it, there are these stratifications of like Southeast Asian or Indian even is another form of like Asian that gets left behind too. But I have this one quote that's stuck in my head, which is, if we can create media that tells a true story, then our culture will follow suit to become like the media. So for example, we keep waiting for the world to change, but what I concluded was that we have to change the way that the world looks in media, and then the world will like copy what we see. So if we make movies about, let's say, Asian people, then the world will start to accept Asian people as like
Oh, so like making a movie about Asian people doing whatever, right?
Exactly.
Just doing stuff,
not just being good at math.
Yeah, or just not Asian movies about being Asian. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where it's like
just doing stuff. Yeah.
Doing random stuff, not just being like the Asian story. And so that's what I liked about your book was. It was a manifestation of this conclusion I'd had in my mind, which was like, hey, here's an Asian person who's just telling the story of his life, not necessarily from the lens of like, here's me as an Asian person, but like, here's me as my specific story. And then the fact that I related so closely to that, which made me feel, like I said, less alone. Because I think that's the other thing. I'm worried, is probably true. There's like all these people just like us, and we all share a very similar story, but because no one's talked about it and because it's not represented in the media, we conclude we're the only one.
Yeah.
And that's really sad.
Yeah, and speaking of which, we're almost at 30, but I'll click the thing again. But
Okay.
So I just reminded me, one of my friends from MIT, from college, she grew up. It was like a very parallel story. They actually grew up in all places in Rochester. So they landed in Rochester, and then I think her dad probably worked at Kodak or Xerox, one of the big companies there back in the day. And then, her first year, she also went to, a really bad inner city school and a really dangerous school. So then they transferred out to the nicer suburbs. And I think she was from, kind of my hometown in China. I mean, I didn't know her back then, but like, it's interesting, like you mentioned, how a lot of these people have these sorts of stories, and I think it's just, if you take people who aren't from the super well educated, wealthy class, right? I mean, if they come, they have all the resources and stuff, but like, if you, I think there's a lot more people like our parents, I would say.
Yeah.
So if you find those people, I mean, my parents always used to say, when they were talking to their friends, like, basically everybody, I mean, this is just for their Chinese friends, but like, everyone in their generation who's come to the U.S. has an interesting story because they like escaped the Cultural Revolution and all the turmoil there, and they were self-selected to be the more adventurous ones, or the lucky ones too, right? They're the luckier and more adventurous ones who were able to come here. So they all had these really quirky stories. But I agree with you that these stories often aren't told because a lot of these stories are like Joy Luck Club or whatever, where it's just like very stereotypical, romance stories or whatever, or Crazy Rich Asians or something.
Yeah. It's very bipolar. It's like, oh, it's either you're like super fobby and like had to escape, exile and poverty and like
Cambodian
execution.
Yeah, I mean,
it's either you were that,
I mean,
or
those
you're
are
like
obviously
a billionaire
yeah,
who
that's
then
right.
got like $1 million suite here in like San Francisco.
And maybe that's what I mean. If
between.
we're thinking about movies, like those are the things that make movies, right? They're the really melodramatic things. I mean, not to underscore, obviously genocide is a bad thing, and like those things are super serious. But like those things make movies. You're escaping genocide somewhere, or you're like Crazy Rich Asians or something. But a lot of these ordinary stories aren't told in mainstream media. But I think that's why writing and blogging and these videos, this stuff is so powerful because everyone can just make it, right? Like you don't have to get people's permission
for funding,
to make it and stuff.
All right. Good evening. We're here with Philip and Tergel, that's me, and we are talking about On the Move, which is an immigrant story of a child who came from China to Switzerland to Louisiana to New York, and then where else?
California.
And then California,
yeah,
that's right. And I read the book on a flight from Beijing to San Francisco, and my story is from Mongolia to New York to San Francisco, and I think the book allowed us to feel connected in a way that I think I had never felt before because I thought I was alone in my immigrant story, but our stories overlapped in very similar ways that made me feel much less alone, but also much more hopeful that there are lots of other people that probably share the same story that we do, and I think it's important to get the story out there so that other people feel like they're struggling through things that we have gone through as well.
Here, give me the mic.
There you go.
Before, when we had the webcam, I would just pass the mic. But yeah, it's I think like you mentioned in the last part that we'll edit together, this idea of just me telling a really specific story. That was sort of the goal, right? So I purposely didn't have any grander plans, right? So like this was not any kind of grand sociological analysis of the world or whatever. It was very zoomed in, right? It was very n equals 1, like one person. I mean, I did kind of talk about other stuff, but it was extremely, extremely zoomed in. And I think that was part of the appeal for people, because maybe like, other people like yourself reading it, they don't relate to 100% of it, but because it's so specific, if you relate to this chapter or this part, like, wow, that was really cool. Because like, obviously your story is not exactly the same as mine, but like there's enough overlaps, that everyone's stories kind of weaves together, and there's enough overlaps there that, I should really promote it more. It's funny because I don't even have it as a front thing on my website anymore, just because like other stuff is more higher priority now, right? And it's like, it was so long ago that I don't have that as top billing anymore. Like, I'm not really known for like this thing I wrote about my childhood so many years ago, but maybe we should bring it back.
Well, so one thing I've been working on is learning to tell my story, which is, again, one thing I was extremely impressed by is the fact that you had the diligence and the work ethic and the dedication to write a 200-page book about your childhood. One, that you remembered correctly and wrote it down, but two, it synthesize itself into a piece of text that can easily travel, right? Because that's another thing. Ebooks are so easily transferred from one person to another. And I have been meaning to do that, but it's really stressful.
It's daunting.
It's so stressful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I had the benefit that my mother encouraged me to write about a lot of this stuff when I was younger. So I had very rough notes, and then we told these stories a lot, right? So like I told a lot of these stories to people when I was younger, and then my parents would tell these stories also. So like, that was always on my mind. And then I think for reels, I started writing. I don't remember. I have all these. I'm also like very OCD about keeping all my data. So like I have all my data from like, I think I have all my stuff from my computers since I was in 8th grade. So before or 7th grade, before I moved to California, I didn't keep anything. But so I think in high school probably I would write very rough drafts of parts, and then that summer was the summer between my junior and senior year, because I was just working. I had like a boring cubicle job, internship. I just had a super boring job that summer, and I would just spend my nights and weekends just writing, and I had a lot of writing experience just from personal writing before, so I hammered that out, and it was in a very rough form, and then 3 years later, like 2007, when we actually got a deal to kind of publish it, that was a forcing function motivating me to go back, and that was I was interning at Google that summer. I think that was my first year of grad school. I was interning at Google, and then I again spent mornings or nights or weekends doing that, and it was polishing it up and tightening it and sending it. I actually sent it to quite a few friends for feedback around that time, and getting it really tightened, and getting it to like short enough that it's like bite sized. But yeah, I mean, I would encourage everyone to do this, and maybe nowadays video is the thing, or maybe like who cares about you do stuff on video and on audio, like who cares about having a book, a podcast, a video might be a better form.
That's one thing. I had another woman who actually approached me to tell my story, and she's actually making a documentary about my life from a mental health perspective, because I think that's another thing I'm learning to talk about is my struggles with depression and other mental illnesses that was actually a result of my traumatic childhood. And there's also sometimes there's the word trauma that's applied to my childhood because it was different. But I also have been questioning what is considered traumatic, because in some ways, when other people who have had, let's say, completely normal lifestyles think it's traumatic that I met my parents when I was, 8 or 9 years old.
Same here, yeah.
They're
or
like,
home
oh my
alone,
God.
or I had to be home alone a lot, right?
And they're like, how could that happen to you? Or like that I was switching hands between family members as a child. And like psychiatrists will be like, that's trauma. Actually, that's like not having stability, not having trust in the world, not having people to look up to. Like that's actual trauma that's going to have long-term effects on your brain development. And so, I mean, I'm a highly functioning individual, but it also makes me wonder, what were the effects that having this type of lifestyle had on me? and who have I become because I faced that adversity versus would I have been the same way had I been raised in a traditional household.
I mean, what did you? I mean, just speculate. If you kept growing up in Mongolia, if your parents didn't come here and they continued their career path there, how would your life been like in Mongolia? Like, would it have been better off? Would they have been okay? Would they have been poor in Mongolia? Like, would it have been too much turmoil? Like, if you had just grown up there.
I think given my mother's audacity and like intelligence and wit, she would have found a way to survive and not survive. I think to thrive. And I would have been a byproduct of that. But again, just like opportunities there aren't like I probably wouldn't be working at Apple, right? I wouldn't have been educated in the same way. I probably would have been educated there and maybe not ever spoke English. So and
you would have felt you had a much more normal life there, just kind of
true.
Whatever people did there.
Normal in terms of like the Mongolian standards. But then now I think about it and it's like for my parents, I mean, they really achieved the American dream. Even though they didn't even know what it was when they came here, right? They were just like, let's see what's going on. And I also don't like to dwell on like what could have happened. It's more like, how did what actually happened affect me? Because one of the things I find when I reflect on my childhood is a lot of emotions come up, which I think then prevents me from being able to write it down. But also seeing my grandfather this summer and seeing what a jolly man he is made me question all my memories I have of him being this really strict man that I felt really impacted the way I saw the world. And I became a perfectionist because of my grandfather. But now I'm like, wait, was he always a jolly man and I just remember the worst parts of him and like created a narrative around who I thought he was? Or was he actually this like very strict, like cold man that I thought I grew up with? And now I really don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to remember.
In hindsight, I feel like I want to tell a story versus when you're in the moment, something totally different might have been happening.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's memories are so unreliable, including, especially kids, right? Yeah. And like, even when I was writing all this stuff, I mean, I had notes, but like, I'm sure the stuff was not 100% accurate, right? But I think the broad brushes of it were fairly accurate and captured my feelings at the time. And going back to that issue you brought up is that like, that's right. Like if my parents or I just kind of listed off on the checklist all the stuff I went through, it seems super weird, right? It's like the parents left. I didn't meet my parents or my mom until I was 5, and then like I was home alone a lot when I was younger, right? Because they had to work, and we didn't have babysitters and stuff, and like all these things that like it would be all these red flags, right? But
from a Western perspective,
exactly. Yeah. But fortunately, I felt like I coped with it pretty well, and again, there's so many factors, right? So, and I'm definitely not an expert on that issue. And there are definitely people who, would grow up with the same conditions and fared much worse. And maybe it's luck, maybe it's circumstances, maybe it's personality, maybe it's how my parents and I get along. But it's I think it's a really complex topic because there is, this whole giant topic of this intergenerational conflicts between, second generation Asian American kids and their immigrant parents, especially with girls and their parents, right? Because there's gender divide and different expectations and stuff, and even my parents told me. I mean, they told me straight up that like because I was a boy, like I probably had it way easier off, right? Just culturally and everything. And if I were a girl and growing up in these conditions, like how they would treat me or how family would treat me and everything, like it would have been very different, perhaps. So I kind of. I was fortunate in that way, I guess.
That's true. And that's one thing I don't know, you can't really divide either. Because one of the questions I remember being asked a lot when I worked at Apple was, how do you think you contribute as a woman? Like, what do you think makes the team different because you've now arrived? Because I was, the first woman hired onto the team. And again, a lot of the meetings, me and my manager would be the only women. They're like, how is the room different because you're there versus not? And I remember thinking, like, sometimes I wonder if I have more impact as an immigrant or more impact as a millennial or more impact as, like, an artist, right? And all the different things that identify me.
Yep. Because you don't want to just be known as,
as the woman.
Yeah.
And that's where it's hard to segregate which parts of us are a result of which experience.
I think it's super complicated, and that's why I'm always hesitant to make these black and white, like going back to the beginning, with these very stark polar things, even though they make for good clickbait headlines or book titles or stuff, but because like, I think everyone who has studied this stuff or even just talked to people knows that people are so complicated, right? Mm-hmm. And that, these headlines make for, these really stark things that, people who tend to be X do Y or whatever, or so they make for good clickbait headlines. That's not how people really are.
Mm-hmm. Right? So I have a question. What do you think you're going to do about the book now that we've had this conversation?
Now that we've had this conversation. Now it changes everything. Now that we have millions of people watching this.
Mm-hmm. Especially so high produced.
Yeah, it was high production value here with 1080p video. I think, one of the things that I was interested in is to do more of this stuff, right? Just to talk to more people like yourself. And the nice thing about having the podcast and having the vlogs and having a video format is that it gives me a platform on which to do this stuff, right? So before I could do writing, and you can, write blog posts. And I actually had some people write like guest posts about like growing up Asian American. Like it wasn't ever a big part of it because like a lot of people aren't like amazing at writing. So like I didn't want to just post random stuff. Mm-hmm. But now there's a video format. I think in my head, I would just seek out more of these opportunities so that, after a while, we'll build up organically a body of work about this stuff. And, as I hopefully get more senior in my career and I can kind of branch out for more stuff, I think definitely exposing this a lot more would be on my radar.
Mm-hmm. Rather than just like the PhD
story. Exactly. Yeah. I think that this would, you've inspired me to kind of have a resurgence of this, but not in the next few months, I guess, unless we have more interviews like this. But I could definitely imagine seeing more and more of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. From your content creation perspective.
Yeah, I think so. Like the really nice thing about having a video format or whatever format I've set up, that I have a workflow, right? It's like I can just upload a video, it goes to a podcast stream, it goes on iTunes, it goes on YouTube. Mm-hmm. It's so easy, and then when it becomes easy enough, then you just do more and more and more and more and more of it, right? Mm-hmm. Like this is why whenever I talk to people about getting started is really hard, right? Because if you've not really blogged or you don't really make videos, and you're like, oh, I have to make my first one, and it's like, it's like from 0 to 1 is big, right? But now that I have this, and it's a bigger thing. I mean, what I did a few years ago is I actually pulled out the excerpts from the book chapters, and I just kind of wrote them as individual blog posts. So it's a little bit more bite-sized, because like people are like, oh, it's 200 pages, it's kind of big. Then I just pulled out a bunch of like 5-minute excerpts and just put them online. As blogs. But what ideas do you have for that? I mean, what would you want to see?
Well, so I have this idea. It's called My Superhero, and it's the story of my mom. So, and I think that's one thing I personally am very attached to is the story of my mom, because she's the one who did everything. It's shockingly, it's like, how do these women have the ability to make these amazing decisions on behalf of their kids, their family, themselves? And a lot of it is immigrant stories. It's mostly like women who've decided to leave their country or leave their child or start something new. And it doesn't have to be one of adversity. It just has to be a mother for me. And so that's one place where I thought about a TV show, right? Like a TV show called My Superhero. And it's really just anecdotal, one episode deep dives into these women who decided to, like I said, leave their country or go to school somewhere. And then that's the way that this immigrant story gets told. Because I thought about a TV show about an immigrant story, and that was one when I was thinking about my own story and how I would rather have a video representation of my story than a book. Just because I think I'd be better at making the video.
So would you play yourself, or you get someone else?
No, so
what's the representation?
That's where I don't think it would actually then be my story. It would be like, it would be a dramatic recreation based on the events that actually happened, so that it's more of a, like HBO would make it, and it would be more about drama. And I think there are, especially reading your story too, like there are specific bite-sized incidents that are very dramatic and drama-inducing. Versus,
it's very cinematic. You can imagine it.
Exactly, and if you get the right screenwriters and the filmmakers to really think about it, it's really just based on true events. But then it tells these stories that currently have not been told, and that the lens for me was about my mother. because again, I look at my life and I realize for me it's been all circumstantial, whereas I look at my mother's life and that's all more like intentional and powerful, right? It's like she made these decisions and I was just happening to be, you know, experiencing the consequence of those.
And it's the same thing with me, right? It's the exact same thing. That, you know, the story of my childhood is, it wasn't like I did anything, I just had to go along with it, right? But the most I did was to, you know, manage my own emotions as well as I could. I was going along. I mean, my mom had a really similar story. So, so Amy Tan, who wrote The Joy Luck Club and a lot of these books, I mean, she's not as active in writing now, but she was, you know, back in my mother's generation, she, you know, The Joy Luck Club was her most famous book. That was made into a movie in the early 90s. And then she had a bunch of other books that I read and my mother read. And a lot of those books center around those themes. It was about mothers. I guess mothers was really the theme. I mean, it was very women-focused, and especially on mothers. So I think The Joy Luck Club or some of the other books was around, you know, vignettes of four mothers and their daughters, their relationship. So I think that's stuff that,
really?
I think, I don't know if there's Joy Luck Club, or there's a few other books about that. I think that is powerful. And there's also the recent like Fresh Off Boat show, which I have not seen, but that was, you know, very similar of one person's autobiography, and they produced it into a show. And it was more of a comedy and more of a it was
sitcom.
Yeah, it's more of a sitcom, and it was not as much of a dramatic show. But like, there's more and more of this coming up. I think that'll be really amazing. I mean, what do you think you want to do in the short term about this stuff?
The short term,
big.
Yeah, I know. Well, so the short term, from my perspective, is just learning more stories. Because I think you wrote in the beginning, this is not a story about like my mom or how I feel about my parents. This is about me and my experience. But a lot of the, like when your mom showed up in your life, I was curious, like what had happened to her and why this moment that she showed up. And there was, and I was very curious about your story, but from your mother's perspective, and like why she decided to do the things she do and how she was feeling when you told her like, you can go home now.
I think she'd always wanted to write something about her story. Like, I think that's been a lifelong kind of you know, it's been a lifelong goal of hers, but like, you know, she's always into her work and she keeps on working and stuff. But I think that is something she's super interested in theory, but she's not really written reflectively about her own life as much. But yeah, I totally get where that's coming from.
So like right now what I have are probably like 5 or 6 people who have a story of their mother. And like I have one friend who came from Pakistan. Actually, they're all immigrants. Again, it's just because of my friends too and the people I've become really interested in. And they're all like, again, for Pakistan, it was more like a refugee situation, whereas like mine was like truly like, okay, what is out there? And it feels like your mother is more like pursuing education. And then there's all these different lenses into which these mothers had to make these big decisions. But right now, the short term is in my head, there's just a library of stories of mothers, mother immigrants, and that accumulating to, I don't know, maybe 10. It's like if I reach 10 stories and if I reach 10 people who would then be willing to at least write something or have something that then we would take to a screenwriter to say, how do we adapt these personal memoirs to then make a 10 episode season to then pitch to a producer or any television network. Or again, another approach is the videographer who I'm working with, and how right now we could make my episode be the first episode.
Well, and like, you know, not just, you know, big production TV show. I mean, there's this. So this is like this Wong Fu Productions. Like they're a very famous Asian American. They actually came from UCSD, and they have this Yappy show, right? This Yappy series, which is like, you know, 13 episodes. And they just produced they funded on Kickstarter or whatever. And it was about, you know, young Asian, you know, working professionals, and it was, you know, I don't know much about it, but this is the latest in that strand. And so the other thing is just to make your own production, right? That you know, now with YouTube and everything, you know, it's gonna take money and it's gonna take capital and stuff. But like, if there are people here who are well connected or who have money from tech or whatever. Like these projects, they cost money, but they don't cost that much if you just get people to just volunteer their time. It's a very grassroots thing instead of like going through the whole Hollywood system. Like that just is huge,
true,
right? I mean,
it's very.
That's daunting.
I think that way because I worked
Yeah.
in the television industry.
Yeah, it's huge. But I mean, that can make huge impact. But like that's starting off. I mean, I'm just really encouraged by watching folks on YouTube and just people who are more independent. And it's also because I don't have to make my living off it, right? I mean, you need to make your living off it, then you probably want to go into a more mainstream industry.
Another thing I don't think we touched on and was I mentioned the secret escape plan and always being ready for any situation, which I don't think is a specifically immigrant situation. It's more like a child, right? When a child is in vulnerable situations, the mental coping mechanisms they use, which is like protecting themselves. And that was one thing I wanted to ask was if you stopped doing that, and if you did, how?
Yeah, so I actually, I mean, growing up, I grew up fairly paranoid about, and also that compounded with, watching the news, right? It's like if you watch the news, back in the day, there's only TV, right? There wasn't anything else. So the news is always about kids getting kidnapped or murderers on the loose or serial killers and stuff. Yeah. And that growing, and I think, thinking about, you're talking about mental health and stuff, thinking about that, I would say that the biggest effect on me when I was a kid was that I was probably more paranoid and more scared. Because we grew up without stability and sometimes in not so nice areas, and so just thinking about what could go wrong and stuff, and I feel like I grew out of that sort of very paradigm mindset I would say probably in high school, because once we moved to California, we were in a much very safe area. It was very wealthy suburb, and it wasn't super wealthy, but it was it was well off suburb and such, and those issues just didn't really come up. But that said, though, I remember one of the things my mom always told me was that, out of all things, was that like she didn't want me like riding in cars with too many like boys, especially like Asian boys, right? Because it looked like you were in a street gang or something, right? Like they would go drive-by shooting or whatever. Even though we lived in a very white area, we didn't live in the city, right? And there weren't many Asian people around either, right? Like to be in cars with. But like she was very well aware, inside in LA there were all these street gangs and stuff, and if you have 4 Asian boys in a car, and it just seems dangerous, right? So she was, I guess my mom also talked to me more about these things to be more cautious. But like, kind of like you mentioned, until getting your email, I hadn't thought about these things for 10 years or more. And maybe part of it, we don't have time to go on this now, but maybe part of it is that I just didn't think about Asian American identity or that stuff ever since becoming an adult, because I was so focused on, my professional career and everything, and that I didn't feel like that held me back or anything at all, because I felt like, I don't really have an accent. I am fairly assimilated and stuff. And maybe embracing that side of me more in the future may be an actionable thing. But I just haven't in the last 10 years.
Because another thing, I mean, in my experience right now working in tech, like there are a lot of Asian people, but there's not a lot of Asian leadership. Right? That's one thing I noticed really quickly is like my boyfriend is Asian, and he's a CEO, and we hosted a CEO event, and he was the only Asian person actually, and I was just shocked that like white person after white person after white person, and I'm like, welcome, like hello. But we also went to a lot of like fundraising dinners for movies, and that's another place where I saw like only white people, and so that's where it's like, even though like you've taken on more of the identity as like a computer scientist, that's also where I think it's still important to remember that we're still minorities. Yeah. And even though there's still like the stereotype that we're, more mathematically inclined and more successful in the tech industry, it's like, okay, yeah, but there's a wall that everyone's hitting. There's
bamboo ceiling, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is something that has gotten a bit more and more attention lately. It's gotten a fair amount of attention in the press. I mean, I think the predominant, just talking about, tech and Hollywood are the two really big things. I mean, it's most industries, but just say the ones we know are in California are tech and Hollywood. And, the big glass ceiling things are for women primarily. I mean, just because just percentage population wise, that's the most. Yeah. And then, the Asian American experience, the Indian American, Chinese American experience, and other Asian groups experience. That bamboo ceiling effect has, people have started to talk about that more and more. And I think that with our generation and beyond, things will change, but like I think you mentioned this near the beginning, but they'll only change if people are doing it, right?
Yeah.
Like they're not changing from above; they're changing because more people of Asian descent are becoming, trying to go into leadership roles, going to business roles more, and not being, purely in software or in academia or engineering and stuff. But that's a giant topic.
Yeah, that's a whole different topic.
So any parting thoughts from our hour?
I just wanted to say thank you, right? Because that's why I wrote the email, because I figured you probably hadn't looked at this in a while.
Yeah.
I saw the date it was written, and I was like, wow, I know so much about you from your professional perspective, and you were my professor. It's like my first impression. And then having this like really deep connection where I'm like, wow, I felt all the things that he felt as like a 10-year-old, right? and again, I haven't yet read a book like that again, like you said, was very detailed, which allowed me to connect to those specific moments. And again, it just aspirational in that, if you can get your story out there, you don't know who it's going to touch and how it might affect their lives.
Yeah, well, thank you for reaching out, and I think the timing worked out super well.
It's very serendipitously as well.
Yeah, and this is like we were talking about earlier. This is the planting the seeds of something in the future, because I think that you asked me earlier, what am I going to do with this in the future? Is that I think that creatively planting the seeds for this, expanding this in the future is definitely on my mind. It's just that it's nebulous at this point, but sometime hopefully in the coming years we can point back to this moment as the start of something.
The culmination, yeah.
Yeah, the start of something. All right.
You'd also have to have like an identity, because like for you, I think there's two different identities, right? And one that you may have forgotten about, but is still very relevant since that's what you look like too.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's like very clear.
And I think that I think that it'll come around full circle eventually, and I think it's already coming that way, because I feel like as I get older and as I become more of in a mentoring role and in a more of a advisory mentoring role, I think that I will come to embrace that more, because there are, and especially now I'm in UC San Diego, there's a lot of Asian American students, right? Not just the ones that the Chinese and Koreans. They're a lot of, but we have the thing I really like about being in a public university in California is that we have a lot of Asian American students who are of underrepresented, are an underrepresented group in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Mongolia, and it's not just Chinese American nerds who are doing well with SATs, right? It's a broad class. So I feel like as I get older and have more wrinkles and step into more of a mentoring and advising role, I feel like that will come full circle into that. Because I felt like in the middle of my life, I had to build up my own career, right? But as I get older, I definitely feel like you said, you can't really, change the way you look and such, unless you're Michael Jackson, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could. Well, we're getting there. You could just be a completely different person.
But all right, well, that's a lot to think about. So we'll see where this leads.
Thanks again.
Yeah. All right. Let's head out of here.